with a place to show it, and everybody behind it, and we will learn about our past.
The new museum, it's the most exciting thing to happen to Campbell River in the 13 years that I've been here. It means a lot to me, and I think it's going to mean a lot to my kids.
We've been museum enthusiasts since it began. We've watched it grow from there to its present site, and now this is beautiful.
Yes, that's going to be wonderful, just wonderful.
And I think this is going to be the center when we get cultural tourism is the big catchword now, and I think we'll be able to, with this building, we'll be able to attract people in.
It's going to be, from what I understand, a very hands-on people place where you can do things, exciting things, and I think the community is going to be surprised, and I think they should get behind it now to make it a little easier and happen a little quicker.
You know, this new facility is going to have an enormous impact on the type of infrastructure that we need in our community to attract conventions, to attract the mini cruise ship industry that's starting to develop on the coast.
We have a lot of artifacts stored. We've never been able to exhibit them, and with the new floor space, hopefully we'll be able to really represent all facets of the community and generally broaden the appeal of the museum to everyone.
We had a vision then that would be an absolutely marvelous site for the new museum. To see it actually happen is tremendous. It's creating one of the building blocks culturally that this community has really missed and sadly lacked for a good many years.
The museum was a small museum in the Centennial Building, and Rose McKay was the curator. An amazing person. It was a very crowded little museum too. We did have little sections of, there was one tiny section that was sort of pioneer section. There was another section which was First Nations art, which was quite a bit bigger. And then we had some glass cases with different artifacts in them, but you couldn't really see what was in those cases at the time because everybody brought things in, and Rose took everything that everybody brought in and piled it on with little notes on top of the glass cases, and that was all part of the interesting part of the museum. But if you were to look in the storage area, which wasn't very big, there were so many beautiful pieces that were stacked in there in a way that you could not possibly enjoy them or appreciate them or see them. So from that time, I think people were already talking about the fact that we needed a bigger museum.
Of course, it was still in the little Tai Plaza building, the Centennial Building. And it was small, but it was still pretty interesting. You know, you can still go to a small community museum up and down the province that is that size and be confronted with lots of typewriters and wedding dresses and lots of dust. And it wasn't of that sort. It had the two exhibition halls, the First Nations Hall and the Pioneer or Settler Hall. And particularly the First Nations exhibits were set up so that it felt like life was happening or the things were in use. And so it was pretty interesting, and John Frischholz was such a good interpreter. He was still the director of the museum director-curator, when I started.
Well, I really liked it. I think it's still one of my favorite small museum installations with all that rough cedar and the rocks, which were security. You know, it was amazing how we would all jump whenever anybody heard a rock move. And it meant that things didn't have to be behind glass. I thought it was just really a delightful installation. It was within probably a week of my working at the museum, a colleague from UCLA who is a linguist who was working with Sam came to the museum to meet me, and he said, "I'm going to take you to meet Sam Henderson." So he took me to the old carving shed next door to Sam and May's house, and Sam, as I recall, sat me down and said, "I'm going to teach you how to do your job." And I thought, boy, it doesn't get any better than this. I mean, really. And so he would come into the museum and he'd tell me about the pieces and basically how to look after them. I mean, I knew from conservation, but there's a very different way that the Kwakwaka'wakw look after their regalia when it's in storage.
John Frischholz, even then in the late 70s, he was offering particularly around programming, the kinds of programming that you expect in a larger museum. And, you know, a larger collecting philosophy, and even Ed Mead before him had, you know, a bigger vision about how exciting the artifacts were, particularly of First Nations culture. So there was that, but Jay definitely had a, you know, let's roll up our sleeves here, let's get really professional about this.
And the board, when they hired me, did say that they wanted a new museum. And I don't have any memory now of how urgent that was, but I knew that there needed to be a lot of planning that needed to happen long before we could even consider a spade in the ground.
I think almost from the get-go, Jay in particular and the board, Jay then the director of the museum, and the board really felt like the space was too small for how big the story potential was. I mean, we were covering the whole of the North Island. The museum had been around since '58 by then. It had a pretty interesting collection. And it was just too small a space. And not a great building in terms of environmental controls.
Always it was Jay's leadership, her enthusiasm, her ideas, her goal that drew me in and kept me enthusiastic and just so impressed with her, not steadfastness, because that sounds very dull, but just her reveling in the stories we had to tell and how wonderful it would be to have a new museum to tell them in.
Jay is a visionary, and I think she could see right from the get-go that not only were there the environmental controls for the artifact and too small a space to really tell the stories, but that a museum could be a more exciting place than what that little building offered. I think some of the first conversations were about could we put a second story on? Could we expand on the site? But we were right on the footprint of that building, and the building wasn't worth adding on to. It was, as you say, it was only 10 years old, but it wasn't built to be a lasting building.
So Jay had a dream, and she was going to go for it. So I just didn't know that it was going to be quite that much work.
When people began to talk about a new museum, I thought it would be interesting to try and see if I could make some small contribution. But I didn't know that it was going to take place over a period of about 20 years. Initially didn't get very much support. I can remember making an ill-fated presentation to council early on, and not one, not two, but 3 motions were defeated. We went away from that meeting rather discouraged, because not only did they not agree to help us out financially with a $5,000 grant to make some specific arrangements, architecture and so on and so forth, but they really didn't even want to have us come back again. So that was a low point, but after that things began to improve.
You know, peaks and valleys, that's for sure, in how committed we were, and in various recessions would dip down, and it would get even more difficult to access money, and there'd be all kinds of wrangling going on, because the amount of money we were trying to raise was significant for such a small community in not great economic times. And there was a woman, an advisor that we worked with named Joy Leach, who was based in Nanaimo, and she was a great rallier of the troops. And she was really helpful. We had quite a few meetings with her, and she'd kind of come in and talk to us about, you know, let's get all the who's in Whoville working together here. This community needs to get fully on board. You team of history buffs, board staff, volunteers can't just do this. The whole community has to be excited about what you're up to. And so I think we kind of took a few steps backwards and thought, okay, we need to get the whole community excited about what we can do. And so that makes a thing go slower. I mean, meanwhile, Jay was always, you know, she was always hunting and gathering out there, looking for connections and contacts and people and funding sources at all times. But we also, inside, said, okay, programming has to get way more exciting. And we can't do that just within this little building. We have to move way past this building and program out there into the community so they can see how exciting this could be.
It was one thing after another, and then Jay got this idea that we gotta get this building. And fundraising, which I hate, you know, it is awful.
Once you start to get some of the business people, Rotary, involved, then some good things began to happen. But to be fair, the economy was not really good at that time. And of course, Campbell River had probably 15,000, 17,000 people, not 33 or 34,000 people. The resource industries, logging, fishing, mining were not doing that well, and so the council had to be very careful with the way tax dollars were spent. And I think a museum seemed rather pie in the sky at that time.
Bob Osler, as the mayor, had great foresight. This is the time we sit down and start to plan for the needed infrastructure in the community. You don't really have a good community unless you have the cultural side. But we also needed the infrastructure side, like the sewage treatment plant and water, and all those things had to be constantly monitored and thought about for future upgrades. So it wasn't just the side that keeps the soul of the community alive. It was the body too. But the soul took preference when we started to think about what was possible, and the museum was high on the list because we already had wonderful things to show in a museum. We just didn't have any place for it.
There were a lot of federal grants at one time supporting culture during the Trudeau and after. And so a lot of our planning actually was paid for by using employment grants or special grants to hire experts. And we did have fundraising events. We had museum days, which were held down at the pavilion, Foreshore Pavilion. And again, I mean, the number of people who came out to those and the people who worked for them, it was phenomenal. You know, the Hendersons would do their salmon and the salmon barbecue. Like at least every year there was something that was a fundraiser. We had art auctions, and I asked people who you shouldn't really ask, like Tony Onley and big names. And I said, you know, what I'd like to do is have you donate a piece, but we will pay you the fee that you would have got if you'd sold it through your art dealer. And that was new to them. They were always being asked to donate works of art, and they would get nothing for it. So, and these are pretty big names. So most people said yes, much to my amazement. And so we ended up with a pretty spectacular collection of art that was auctioned off by a volunteer from Maynard's Auction House. Again, this is another, I'm sure I learned this from Joy. If you don't shoot, you miss for sure.
Raising funds for a new museum, why not? You know, we made fun of it, and you know, we carved stuff and donate it, and little fundraiser, just anything that you could make a little money doing.
From the very beginning, volunteers were key, because you can't, I mean, it was a working board, and there was museum staff who were equally dedicated, and I'm sure worked hours over the time that we were managed to be able to pay them. But the volunteers, especially when it came to fundraising, which in different activities, I mean, we had walkathons, we had an art auction. Oh, we just did a great many things. All those things were organized with volunteer help.
I know that there was the leadership committee for the final push of local fundraising was really an important group of important people.
The board really strategized about finding the right people who had the right connections in different quarters of the community, both with provincial politics, federal politics, city politics, and yeah, Jay worked really hard at that. When she decided to, join some of the clubs that were sort of bastions of men and women weren't welcome, and she was a newbie amongst women in Rotary, let's say, we all thought, well, good luck. But, she did a great job of that kind of thing.
What became clear over the years is that gradually the board kind of whittled down to those who were absolutely passionate about having the new building come into being. And so the board really began to work as a whole. And we began to, as people left, we would discuss, well, who do we need to fill that spot, and where are we missing some section of the community that could play a large role in our hope for a new museum, and so we would bring that person on board. And I would guess, just going by memory, that the last 10 years we were pretty solid.
There was a knock on my door, and there was Stephanie Tipple and Jay Stewart. And they looked very uncomfortable, and they said, "We just want to talk to you, Morgan. And we wondered if you would like to sit on the board of the museum." And I was delighted. I was really, I really was quite eager to become involved. And so that's how it started, with these two girls at the door.
And we also worked with our MLA, who was Colin Gableman, and he was in opposition. But he was the kind of MLA that didn't want to make a big splash for himself, but he would go and just talk quietly about the importance of the museum and how good it would be for the community, and so why wouldn't they just give us the money? And we ended up getting it, and I'm sure it wasn't just him. It was him, it was us going down, meeting with cabinet, it was other factors as well, but we ended up doing very well. And so once all that money started coming in, we really felt that we were on our way.
We also had to identify the location for the building. And there were several options, and you know what, I'm not sure I can remember more than two at this point. One was on the Indian Band development, and the other one was the current site. And there was money in the municipal budget or the municipal funds available to purchase parkland. And so I believe that it was municipal money that paid $305,000 for the land. Although Lauren Anderson and I went to Victoria and then to Vancouver to try to get the province to give us it for $1, and they wouldn't. So there's a no. They charged us $305, but it's probably worth a bit more than that now. Particularly the business community and the Chamber of Commerce did not give support to the museum being up here on this escarpment. They wanted it downtown in the plaza, somewhere around near the Thai Plaza. They wanted it there because it attracted people. It would also attract them to the business community and to the restaurants and so on. And I believe that because that downtown area was on landfill, it had a specific significance to whether we would be able to get federal funding if we built on that, had our entire
a collection sitting on land that in an earthquake may not be stable. And so it was a confirming factor that we should be here, but at the same time, the downtown continued their resistance for quite a long period of time. So it hampered our ability to fundraise as well, because we were having to justify ourselves continually with our determination to be on this piece of property.
We were under pressure to, if we were going to have a new museum, to locate it downtown. This was considered way out of town. There was pressure to combine it with community hall, maybe a hotel facility of some sort, and we decided that with what we had in mind, we would rather have it a standalone, and so it's not out of town anymore.
Downes Archambault were the architects who were selected, Barry Downes and Richard Archambault. And they were really accomplished, very highly regarded architects at the time. In fact, all of the people who submitted their expressions of interest were really, I mean, I don't think we could have gone wrong with any one of them, but we could do better with some. And so I think we ended up doing very, very well. And they and their staff was extremely supportive right through the process. The first presentation that Downes Archambault made of their concepts for the building were really not what the board was looking for, and it was a somewhat tense meeting of the board. They had done things that were reflective of lighthouses and kind of old industrial buildings, corrugated tin and that kind of thing. And one of the board members just said it so clearly, I've seen enough of that kind of stuff to last me a lifetime. I don't want corrugated metal on this building. And everybody basically agreed. And I think that what we ended up with is architecture, and that's what the architects were hired to do, was to build a building that inspires and reflects and enjoys the view and the location.
I can remember the initial plans were quite large and quite different from what we have here. The trough that takes the rainwater, a celebration of rain in Campbell River, can you believe that? And it falls down into the cistern. And I used to tease the architects that when it was blowing 70 miles an hour in Campbell River, water doesn't fall down, it goes sideways. And we had some fun with them. They were very good. We had Jean-Andre and Dick and Barry basically starting the process at the same time. One was designing the inside of the building, and the other was designing the outside. And so it was logical that they should get together. And I remember going to Vancouver. We met at the Downes Archambault office, and Jean, I must have met him somewhere. But as I recall, they were all fairly nervous to meet each other because they had these huge reputations. But they just immediately got talking and drawing, and just it was so exciting to be in the room with them. We pretty quickly on started working with Jean-Andre and company, who had designed the exhibits for the Royal BC Museum and others around the world. He was by then a private contractor. And also by then we were working pretty closely with Peter McNair from the Royal BC Museum. They were always, from the get-go, pretty supportive.
Having worked with Andre on the whole First Nations gallery and the now new museum, Royal British Columbia Museum, he was, in my opinion, the go-to guy, because I worked with a number of museum designers in my time, and he was the only one really that was ready to go out into the communities. And I allowed him to do a little bit of curatorial work as well. I gave him a couple of projects working with ethnohistoric photographs so that he could have the experience and understanding of who a curator was and what a curator did. And in my opinion, and I've worked and known with quite a number of museum exhibit designers, he ranks at the top. And the Campbell River Museum was at a point in time where it needed a designer, and Andre needed a good contract launching a new career.
And the other role that Peter played is we had the museum in two buildings. We had one that was going to be where the displays, and we had the other that was going to be the Children's Museum, and just all the wonderful things that you want a museum to have. And he sat down and looked at the two designs and said, you probably want to put some of the stuff you have in the Children's Museum into your regular museum, because it might be a while before you can build the second part, which turned out to be never. So it was very, very good advice, and my memory is that Lynn Nash had quite a role in ensuring that the advice that Peter gave was turned into what happened in the building.
I mean, one of the things that I've always felt was really important is that it's not the object, it's the story that the object tells. And we had a lot of objects, and we had a lot of people in the community who had used those objects, and they were getting older. And so Ken Drishka and Elizabeth Johnson were hired on a grant, and they would convene these meetings every second Wednesday. They were held at Irene Ross's home so that they could be sitting around a table and they could look at the maps or the documents and agree or disagree about what the history was that they were talking about, because it isn't always the same version from the same person. And that went on for several months, I believe, and it was a source of, I hope, a lot of really important information about historic events in Campbell River.
We pulled together a team of people who were experts on different subjects. So whether it was Ron Hamilton with New Chalmers People's Culture, or Duncan Stacey about commercial fishing, and we kind of had these big think tanks where they would be all together and tossing ideas around. What are the key stories for North Vancouver Island? And eventually kind of narrowed it down to what did we feel we needed to talk about in the exhibits for the museums or the new museum. And then, of course, well, where were the artifacts became the next question, and a search for target artifacts started, which was really fun. Getting together some of the old-time loggers and saying, we need a logging truck, we need an early one. Where is one? Well, I saw one up in the bush in Smith's Inlet, 40 years ago. I wonder if it's still there. And so there was all of that scrambling about to actually see, well, could we tell the stories that we had identified as the key stories, and did we know enough? Well, we didn't. So then we, again, because it was the 80s and there were all kinds of LIP make work projects around, we were able to hire people and do these research kind of programs where we got the information we needed, and then interfaced with Jean-Andre, who he came up, he met with us, we said, okay, here are the key stories that we want to tell, and here's here's this kind of an outline of what we know about those subjects. And he was always, well, feed me, I need to be fed, I need more information, I need to get excited. And he'd have out his kind of see-through vellum paper and the projected floor plan underneath it. And we'd talk, and he'd start sketching an idea of what that might look like as an exhibit. And we'd look at it and go, well, that's not quite right, because it wasn't like that. It didn't work like that. Okay, he'd just lift that one up, put another one down, and start some more. He was just amazing with his creativity. He was he was, you know, I remember from working with different architects that we had involved later, they were just so married to their ideas that they'd come up with, and he wasn't married to any of them. He'd just throw some out. You didn't like that, he'd throw some more out.
Well, when I first saw the plans, I thought, what a great edifice this is going to be, or series of them, because it was from the time of the original concept, and as the concept developed over the years prior to my coming on the board, it became more and more grandiose, and the board was seeking more and more revenue to do this. And of course the feds got involved, and the province got involved, and the city got involved, and everybody had committed funds to it, or at least made a commitment to it, if not real dollars. And of course, I think the thing that kicked it over the top was the fact that there was federal money available, and they had given us an extension and extension and extension and so on, and finally they were going to say, you have to, what's the vernacular, you have to pee or get off the pot?
We were just so close at that point to being able to start, but not quite there financially. We hadn't raised quite enough to begin construction. So between the museum board and all the helpers and the council, we decided that this was an opportunity to do some borrowing. We felt we were far enough along that we could do this and repay successfully, that the museum would be able to do that. And so council decided unanimously that we would back the museum for this. We would be the guarantor for this loan so that we could get construction underway.
There weren't any other people on the board at the time who were looking for another job. So I said, well, okay, I can do that. And I'm handy, so in terms of being close by, so I can drop over regularly to see what's going on. I'm not a construction manager or anything like that, so I said I don't have that expertise, but if I can talk the school board into lending me Max Vorkamp from time to time, who was a developer and built a lot of buildings in Campbell River, then he will be able to let me know where the corners are being cut by the people who are building, and see if we can get it done right.
And the building of the museum was actually a wonderful experience for me, because by that time my office was up in the old building that remains on the site, and I got along well with the building project manager, I guess he was. He was a hard taskmaster for his workers, but he was really fair, and he really dealt very, very well with the suppliers of the building materials in town. And I was able to catch some things that were happening that I thought, I don't remember this in the plans. We made a few necessary changes. And for that, the Dominion Company is to be thanked, because we didn't have any change order costs that I recall. God, it was something else to see that building going up.
The heat was in and the light was in, and yeah, the keys were handed over. There were no exhibits. It was a big empty space, and I can't remember who came up with the idea, but we thought we should really celebrate this. So we decided to have a New Year's Eve gala. I think the board and all kinds of volunteers got involved to help put it on. We had filled up with chairs and tables and decorated like crazy, so it looked beautiful even though there was nothing but walls. And we brought in a wonderful dinner and a band for dancing. And it was one of the best New Year's Eve celebrations that Carl and I have ever been to, because it was much more than just New Year's Eve. It was the beginning of something special for the museum itself. Great fun, and people supported it, so it was just jam full. I'm sure there were waiting lists trying to get tickets, but they were sold out completely. So that was our first big gala in a very long time in the whole community, because we had never had that much space before to do it.
The gala there was a kind of a dance and New Year's dance and all that kind of thing, but there was also the big opening event, which the whole empty exhibition hall was filled. There was, I don't know how many hundred people there, and speeches by different people, First Nations leaders and different people. It was wonderful. We all kind of felt like, you know, we did it, and everybody's excited about it.
Gela Castola, Hamaso, Nazmiut. Greetings, my brothers and sisters. Wala Sassans Guela Sirlachota Gukwich. It is a great event that we are present here for today. Kasom lap ikla ka kwetaskes ke nokai. Adamakiso klupakwilala. If you could only feel what I feel in my heart, you would know that my heart soars. For the things that this great house will stand for. And that's why we are here, my chiefs, my noble ladies, so that we can come and help to bless this great building.
Stephanie Tipple, who's chair of the Board of Trustees of the museum.
In the mid-1980s, the Museum Society decided the time was right to take the dream of creating a home for the past, present, and future of North Island to the people and organizations we hope will become partners in our fundraising venture. Without the bounty of North Island, there would be no museum, because there would be no story to tell and no wealth to allow that story to be heard. It is that wealth which enabled our MLA Colin Gableman to help us convince the provincial government to return to this area a grant of $400,000 in 1986 and a further $600,000 in 1991. It is that wealth which enabled our present mayor, Jim Lorney, help us persuade the Government of Canada to grant us $1,130,000 towards the completion of this project. It also, in 1983, enabled Council under the leadership of Mayor Bob Osler to purchase from the province the magnificent land which this structure now graces. And in 1991, under the leadership of Mayor Mary Ashley, commit $500,000 for ground preparation, landscaping, parking lots, and lighting. But as important as the support from our three levels of government has and continues to be, none of this could have occurred without the 15 years of dedication from our volunteers and staff. It's no exaggeration to say, and I actually figured this out, that for the $2,630,000 which the government have contributed to this project, I believe that there is easily 1 hour of volunteer time for every one of those dollars. I also wish to acknowledge the staff of the Royal BC Museum. They have provided advice, assistance, and guidance to our museum since it was founded in the 1950s. These combined forces have joined to create this building, your museum, which will stand among the first-class museums of this nation. But this is not the end of the story, just our beginning. As we of this region struggle with the economic challenges facing us, many of you in this room will be called upon for your wisdom, your fortitude, and your courage in leading us all to grasp change and turn it into success. As you accomplish this, your stories will be recorded, and your triumphs will find a home in this building for your children and your grandchildren. Our vision remains the same as it has for the last 15 years. This museum in Campbell River will provide an exciting and varied destination point for tourists of all interests. It will offer a venue for traveling exhibits of international reputation. It will expand the facilities for research, education, and recreation, providing lifelong learning opportunities for peoples of all ages. And finally, this museum will gather and preserve the information and records connecting our industrial and social history with the land and the sea which surrounds us. Thank you and welcome.
On behalf of the taxpayers of British Columbia, on behalf of the current government of British Columbia, and on behalf of the previous government of British Columbia, former MLA Stan Hagen, current MLA Margaret Lord, former MLA Karen Sanford, many others who were involved at the provincial level in getting the $1 million funding from the province for this project, I want to present this morning on behalf of all of the politicians who have been involved and on behalf of all of the people of British Columbia who contributed the final payment of $1/3 to the Campbell River Museum. George?
Thank you, Colin. On behalf of the Museum Society and the Leadership Committee, which I'm part of, this represents the last payment. You wouldn't by any chance have another one in your pocket for the Mount Washington Road, would you? Yeah. Slack line, blow slack. Watch your eyes, guys. Leave her slack. Okay, are we all ready? I didn't go. Well, I've worked in mining, so everybody's lined up. Okay, we'll have Jim Lordy pass the mallet to Bill Barley and cut the table.
So we finally got this building up and just bare walls, and we had a big dance and to celebrate, but then the work had to start.
Here's this big, largely empty hall, and people were disappointed. Oh my gosh, the letters to the editors, the complainings at the front desk were heartbreaking, I think, for all of us. And I know that in hindsight we all felt like, gosh, we should have just not opened the thing. We should have waited, which would have been sad for the community not to have any museum at all for a while, but better that than them come in here and think that we'd, failed them. So, and of course, it was all of that period of moving in here. Finally, the building's built, but we're nowhere near done yet. We still need to fundraise to pay for exhibits that are much more exciting, dynamic, and expensive than a small community normally thinks of. All of that's yet to do. So staff changed in the middle of all of that. We lost our director, Jay, at that point. And then I stepped in for about a year and a half, I guess. I don't remember exactly how long. And we had a really good fundraising team that she had set up. They were an arm of the Board of Trustees, the leadership committee, and they were fabulous. And they were energized, and they just kept right on rolling.
We still had an empty exhibit area which had to be worked on. So it was until Leisha came in '98, we had areas which were undeveloped.
We didn't replace Jay. We got somebody else who had other skills because the museum was running fine. We needed a PR person and somebody who would really get involved in the community.
As it turned out, Leisha was a dynamo. I mean, really, she just came in and took charge and really helped in lots of ways all of us, because she just hit the ground running.
Oh, I well remember walking in the front door on my first day of work, April 1st, 1998, and I thought, I hope there isn't irony in it being April Fool's Day. I really did. I thought, am I up to the task of what is needed to fill the museum? And it was a virtually empty building that was well planned, but it needed its stories and soul put in, and it was a daunting responsibility. But I also sensed that the staff were there and they knew what they were doing, so I had the support there. And as I said at the first annual general meeting, which was about 2 weeks later, it's also about fundraising. I could tell the members wanted the museum to succeed. So I had staff that were wanting the museum to succeed and committed, and I had board and members that I saw in the audience wanting the same thing. One of the things I realized quite quickly when I arrived is so much time and effort and blood, sweat, and tears had gone into fundraising for the capital campaign of building the museum, that by the time it opened, the board was tired. And some had left, but some had stayed on, thankfully, but they were tired. So there needed to be a renewal both in terms of morale and in some cases soliciting more. And thank goodness for to long-term leadership through Rob McCarricker and Norm Fair, they provided us the focus of going forward and keeping us on track. I heard from various people that there were various reactions from the community. When they came into the museum in '94 when it first opened, it was an empty building. And they said, "You spent $3.1 million on this? What a waste of money." I also heard people had said, "We should really put in the RCMP offices here." So I thought, I'm going to have a lot of work to do to try and bring the community not only into the museum, but on side.
I think without Leisha, a lot of the grants and different things like that, because she was tireless. She just wouldn't leave people alone. I'm sorry, Leisha. And you know what? Leisha worked well with the board. She worked well with the community.
I tried a three-pronged approach. I think I needed to build confidence in the board and the staff both ways. They needed confidence in me, and I needed confidence in them. And that worked very well. The next biggest challenge was money, funding money. Without money, we couldn't do the exhibits. Without money, we couldn't pay off the debt. Without money, we couldn't keep the staff. So I'd say I spent the majority of my time fundraising and friend-raising, which is very related. And the other thing was with the community. I worked very hard to befriend not only our local community, other museums, businesses, governments, potential partners, because it's such a hand and glove together. So those were my approaches, I think, in retrospect.
The teamwork that went on here to create these exhibits was absolutely extraordinary, and the gifted people that came forward, either with their artistic skills to help or with actual artifacts that they were willing to contribute.
I remember our little sawmill just going and going and going and bringing loads of cedar for the splitting shakes, and Al Larson, he had a skid or two, and he got some of those logs for that pioneer cabin. And you know, I think those first bunch of displays that got us going, I think we did them for about $10 a square foot. Most of the material was in kind given, or we bought a few little things, but we did it less than $10 a square foot, where the museum in Victoria was $100 a square foot for theirs.
We also had another big asset in George Murdoch. He had just started as exhibit designer and fabricator, and without him, our exhibits wouldn't be what they are today. He could make silk out of a sow's ear, as the expression goes, and on pennies. So we were fortunate, and he stayed with us right through to the end of all those exhibits. And the other asset, I think, was Human Resources Canada at that time had a program that fit very well for us. It was Job Creation Partnership Program. And we used that very well, even though we often had unskilled workers that, or I shouldn't say unskilled, the skills didn't match the skill set we needed. So there was a lot of mentoring and supervision that, thanks to Sandra and George, who oversaw the exhibits, made it work, because it had to work.
When I look back on it, I mean, and even at the time I recognized, I think that no experienced museum designer or fabricator would have accepted the conditions we worked under. I mean, it was ridiculous.
Yeah.
We were trying to build exhibits in a garage outdoors, and with unskilled labor and a minimum of basic tools. And yeah, it was bizarre circumstances. And I suppose ultimately, you know, if I look back on the thing and think, how did I feel about the exhibits and how they turned out, I would have to say that I'm proud of the fact that we were able to accomplish what we did with the conditions we were doing it under. I think you would find, if you interviewed a lot of people that worked on that they would tell you it was one of the best jobs they've ever had. because it was fun and creative, and one of the things that you try and do when you're running a crew like that, well, there's two things that are essential. One is to maintain a momentum so that you get people rolling and you just keep it rolling, and that was very difficult to do at the museum. But the other thing you try and do is to create a fun working environment where people are happy to come to work. And that was easy to do at the museum.
It was a good place because you'd come to work and you weren't sure what you were going to do that day, which was fun.
We had a lot of businesses, small and large. We had a lot of individuals, donors, volunteers, who always came through for us, whether it was with the boat or whether it was with the logging truck. And that doesn't happen in every community, and it doesn't happen with every museum. But it made the difference between not only the funding that we were able to get, but that community support that, again, I see continuing to this day, whether it's the wood or something needing fixing or a program. So I'm proud of the community for embracing our museum.
I know there are folks that come in here and the first thing they do when they come into town and they don't know anybody is go to the museum and say, I want to volunteer.
It's the soul of the community and the spirit of the community, and it's a living museum for that very reason. You know, it's not just the outside of a building and a few things inside. It holds the community soul.
When I'm here, when I'm teaching a class, like I've been teaching writing classes here for the last couple of falls or more than a couple, and it's Sunday afternoon in the winter, and it should be a quiet little place, and it's so not. We often get bumped. We have to move into the archives for this session because there's some other big program that needs that space, or we can hear all these kids upstairs and all kinds of hooting and hollering, and yeah, so that's exciting. Yeah, definitely. It's what I envisioned.
It's better than I imagined. I never thought we'd get there. But looking back the other night, I thought, holy smokes, all the volunteers and the volunteer materials and stuff, we certainly did it on the shoestring, didn't we?
It's more than I imagined. I think it's a wonderful facility, well run. We've had good volunteers, good staff, good directors from the get-go. Yeah, I'm very proud of the facility and feel good about whatever small contribution I was maybe able to make.
The museum, it meant a lot to my dad. You know, like I say, it was Ed Mead. It started off with him, and it just went on and on. Important people to my father was people he dealt with and passed it on to me.
When you look back to where we started, and not just our phase 2 folks, but the phase 1 folks, and where the museum used to be and what it was, you know, to what it is now. I mean, you can't help but have a sense of a satisfaction. I mean, it's when you look back at it, it's just like almost too much to grasp the amount of activity that we were involved in to kind of get it to where it is now.
There was a Kwakwaka'wakw chief who gave me a name and welcomed me into his family and bestowed some privileges on me. And one of his favorite expressions, his first language was Kwakwala, and he was reasonably comfortable in English. And every now and then he'd say, "You make my heart come glad." And I think every time I go back to the Campbell River Museum, my heart comes glad.
It's been more than 20 years. I mean, it's amazing. It took us 18 years to build it, and it's been there longer than that.
For a town this size, which it was a small logging, fishing, mining town. It's amazing. And the lovely thing is that as it grows up, the museum is there to say, we started a bit of that.